4 in the morning. The destroyer USS Decatur was already cutting through a heavy swell in the Philippine Sea, its radar systems scanning the horizon with invisible pulses of energy. The ship was operating under a modified condition of readiness, but the calm of the pre-dawn watch was about to be shattered by a signal from high orbit. 500 miles to the northwest, a satellite part of the space-based infrared system had detected a massive release of thermal energy from a launch site on the Chinese mainland. This was not a routine exercise. The heat signature was consistent with the solid fuel booster of a DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile, a weapon specifically designed to target large surface vessels at extreme distances. In the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer stared at a blue light on his console that had just turned a steady, pulsing amber. The air in the compartment was chilled to 18 degrees Celsius to protect the sensitive electronics, smelling of ozone and the faint metallic tang of recycled air. Beside him, the radar controllers began the process of slewing the ANSPY-6 radar toward the predicted bearing. They were looking for a needle in a haystack that was moving at 12 times the speed of sound. The computer systems on the USS Decatur began calculating the trajectory, projecting a parabolic arc that reached high into the thermosphere before curving back down toward a point in the ocean currently occupied by the destroyer and its 300 sailors. The commanding officer arrived in the Combat Information Center exactly 45 seconds after the initial alarm. He did not ask for a briefing. He looked at the primary large-screen display and saw the white line of the projected intercept. The United States Navy had trained for this specific scenario for over a decade, but the reality of a live ballistic missile inbound changed the atmosphere of the room instantly. There was no shouting, only the rhythmic, clipped reports of specialists confirming data links with Pacific Command and the 7th Fleet. The Decatur was now the tip of the spear in a defensive network that spanned half the globe, but for the next few minutes, the ship was essentially on its own. On the bridge, the officer of the deck looked out at the black water. The Philippine Sea was running with 3-meter swells, the whitecaps visible only when the moon broke through the thick overcast. The air was heavy with salt and the sharp scent of diesel exhaust from the stacks. Beneath his feet, he felt the vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines as the engineering department brought the ship to full power, increasing speed to 30 knots. The hull groaned against the pressure of the water, a low-frequency shudder that moved through the steel bones of the vessel. They were moving to a new station, trying to complicate the targeting solution of the incoming warhead. But both the captain and the tactical action officer knew that a DF-26 was equipped with an active seeker head that would find them regardless of their position. The DF-26, often referred to in intelligence briefings as the Guam Killer, was currently accelerating through the upper atmosphere. It had reached an altitude of over 150 kilometers, moving into the vacuum of space where it would travel the majority of its distance. The first stage had already burned out and fallen away, tumbling into the East China Sea. The second stage was now pushing the re-entry vehicle to its maximum velocity. On the displays inside the USS Decatur, the target was represented by a small red diamond. It was climbing, gaining the potential energy it would soon convert into a terrifying descent. Tactical data links between the Decatur and other assets in the region began to hum with activity. Information from a TPY-2 radar stationed in Japan and a cruiser operating 200 miles to the south was being fused into a single integrated air picture. Every sensor was locked onto the same point in space. The Aegis Combat System, the brain of the destroyer, was already running through thousands of permutations, calculating the exact second the ship would need to launch its own interceptors. The crew practiced for this every week, but the feeling of the ship accelerating, the sound of the general quarters alarm echoing through the passageways, and the knowledge of the mass of the incoming warhead made this morning feel different. The tactical action officer reported the final trajectory confirmation to the commanding officer. The missile was not headed for a carrier strike group or a land-based facility on Guam. The DF-26 was locked onto the USS Decatur DDG-73 specifically. It was a targeted strike, a calculated test of American sea power and the resilience of a lone Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The commander took a deep breath, the cool air of the Combat Information Center filling his lungs. He gave the order to transition the weapon systems to an automatic engagement profile. The ship was now a closed loop of sensors and shooters, waiting for the target to reach the precise window where the laws of physics would allow for a kill. Outside, the darkness of the Philippine Sea remained absolute, save for the green glow of the navigation lights and the white foam of the wake. The environment was indifferent to the high-tech drama unfolding within the steel hull. The wind continued to scream past the superstructure, and the spray continued to coat the forward Mark 41 vertical launch system cells in a fine layer of salt. In exactly 3 minutes, those cells would erupt in a wall of flame as the first interceptors were sent to meet the threat descending from the stars. 4:05 in the morning. The USS Decatur was no longer just observing. It was actively hunting the ballistic trajectory now screaming through the vacuum of space. The 4 massive fixed arrays of the AN/SPY-6 radar, mounted on the faces of the ship's superstructure, were now pulsing at maximum power, emitting beams of high-frequency energy that searched for the pancake and or forebasing specific radar cross-section of the DF-26 re-entry vehicle. Inside the hull, the electronic cooling systems hummed with a frantic intensity, moving gallons of chilled liquid to keep the radar panels from melting under the sheer thermal load of the tracking operation. The air in the Combat Information Center felt charged with static electricity, a byproduct of the massive power draw that made the hair on the sailor's arms stand up. The tactical action officer called out the track status, his voice steady despite the weight of the 10 seconds ticking away. The target was now 350 miles out and descending through 80,000 feet. It was moving at a speed of 10,000 kilometers per hour, a kinetic energy weapon that carried no traditional explosive warhead but relied on its incredible mass and velocity to shatter its target. On the bridge, the commanding officer watched the countdown on his auxiliary display. The rules of engagement were clear, and the threat was verified. He gave the command that every sailor on the ship had trained for but hoped never to hear. Batteries released. Engage the inbound track with Standard Missile 3. The response from the ship was instantaneous and violent. On the forward deck, the steel hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch system slammed open with a series of heavy metallic clacks. 1 second later, the first Standard Missile 3 ignited. A column of white-hot fire erupted from the deck, a blinding flash that bleached the darkness of the Philippine Sea into a stark, artificial noon. The roar was not a sound so much as a physical pressure that slammed into the bridge windows, vibrating the heavy glass in its mounts. The missile cleared the cell in a heartbeat, a streak of white light that tore upward into the overcast sky, leaving behind a thick, acrid cloud of gray smoke that smelled of sulfur and burnt chemicals. The deck of the USS Decatur shuddered under the force of the launch, the 7,300-ton destroyer rolling slightly to starboard as the rocket's thrust pushed against the hull. 5 seconds later, a second interceptor followed the first. The twin streaks of fire pierced through the low clouds, the orange glow illuminating the undersides of the vapor for a fleeting moment before they vanished into the higher altitudes. These were the outer shield, the long-range interceptors designed to strike the target while it was still outside the atmosphere, using a kinetic kill vehicle to smash the DF-26 into fragments before it could begin its final, high-speed dive. Inside the Combat Information Center, the radar controllers monitored the telemetry of the outgoing missiles. The Standard Missile 3 was performing its programmed pitch-over, turning its nose toward the predicted intercept point. The digital map showed the 2 blue icons of the American interceptors racing toward the single red icon of the Chinese missile. The distance between them was closing at a combined speed of over 20,000 kilometers per hour. The environment inside the ship remained a study in professional discipline. The only sounds were the low-frequency thrum of the gas turbines, and the occasional crisp report from the weapon stations. Outside, the cold wind of the Philippine Sea quickly began to strip away the lingering smoke from the deck, the salt spray already beginning to dry on the hot metal of the launch cells. The battle was now a matter of mathematics and geometry. The Aegis system was calculating the exact millisecond for the interceptors to deploy their third-stage rocket motors. The crew knew that if these two missiles failed, the window for defense would shrink from minutes to seconds. The heat from the first launch had already dissipated, replaced by the biting chill of the ocean air, but the tension remained thick, enough to feel. Every eye in the room was fixed on the closing icons, waiting for the momentary pause in the data that would signal a successful kinetic impact in the silence of space. 4:10 in the morning. High above the Philippine Sea, the two Standard Missile-3 interceptors were shedding their second-stage boosters. The discarded rocket motors fell away like spent matchsticks, tumbling back toward the dark ocean 160 kilometers below. At this altitude, the sky was no longer blue or gray, but a profound and absolute black, salted with the cold light of distant stars. The missiles were now traveling at over 10,000 kilometers per hour, guided by the precision data streaming from the AN/SPY-6 radar arrays on the USS Decatur. In the vacuum of space, the interceptors deployed their kinetic kill vehicles. These were not explosive warheads, but sophisticated flying machines equipped with their own infrared seekers and small divert thrusters. The mission was simple in concept, but nearly impossible in execution. The kill vehicle had to physically collide with the DF-26 re-entry vehicle, destroying it through the sheer force of impact. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Decatur, the weapons controllers watched the telemetry on their screens, their faces pale in the blue glow of the liquid crystal displays. The air in the room was thick with the smell of coffee and the faint, dry scent of ionized dust. The first kill vehicle acquired the target. The DF-26 was a jagged heat signature against the cold background of space, a white-hot friction point even in the vacuum. The American interceptor fired its maneuvering jets, small puffs of hydrazine gas that adjusted its course by centimeters. The geometry was perfect. For a fraction of a second, the two objects were on a collision course that would have ended the threat instantly. But as the range closed to less than 5 kilometers, the DF-26 executed a pre-programmed terminal maneuver. The Chinese missile used its own thrusters to shift its position, a sudden and violent lateral movement that the American kill vehicle had not predicted. The first Standard Missile-3 missed its mark by less than 50 meters. To a human, that distance seems small, but at those velocities, it was as good as a mile. The second interceptor attempted to compensate, its onboard computer processing millions of calculations per second to track the zigzagging warhead. It burned through its remaining fuel in a desperate attempt to close the gap, but the DF-26 was already beginning its descent back into the atmosphere. The second kill vehicle tumbled past, its seeker lost in the glare of the morning sun, just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon. On the bridge of the USS Decatur, the report of a double miss was met with a grim, heavy silence. The commanding officer did not hesitate. He ordered the next layer of defense to be prepared immediately. The ship was no longer trying to stop the missile in space. They were now entering the terminal phase. The DF-26 was gravity-bound and accelerating, turning its massive potential energy into a kinetic hammer that was aimed directly at the center of the ship's radar cross-section. The humidity of the Philippine Sea seemed to press in against the bridge windows, the salt air a reminder of how vulnerable the steel hull really was against a weapon falling from the edge of the world. 4:12 in the morning. The DF-26 re-entry vehicle slammed into the upper layers of the atmosphere at latitude 15 degrees north, 130 degrees east, its carbon fiber skin heating to over 2,000 degrees Celsius. The friction of the air created a shroud of ionized plasma around the warhead, making it temporarily invisible to infrared sensors, but leaving a massive, glowing trail on the AN/SPY-6 radar. On the deck of the USS Decatur, the forward Mark 41 vertical launch system erupted for the third time. as two RIM 174 Standard Missile 6 interceptors screamed into the dark sky. The ship was now at its maximum tactical exertion, every system pushed to the edge of its design specifications. The Standard Missile 6 was the final long-range hope, designed to engage high-speed, maneuvering targets within the atmosphere, at ranges of up to 240 kilometers. Inside the Combat Information Center, the weapons controllers monitored the intercept geometry, their hands hovering over the consoles, as the digital icons for the American interceptors converged on the descending threat. The air in the compartment was heavy with the scent of recycled oxygen and the sharp, chemical bite of overheating server racks. Below the waterline, the engineering crew worked in a world of deafening noise and oppressive heat, maintaining the 30 knots of speed required for the ship's evasive pattern. The vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines moved through the deck plates, a constant, bone-shaking reminder of the power required to move 8,000 tons of steel through a heavy sea. On the bridge, the horizon was beginning to show a faint, bruised purple light, but the beauty of the sunrise was ignored, in favor of the data streaming across the tactical displays. The DF-26 was now moving at 24,000 kilometers per hour, performing erratic lateral shifts to defeat the incoming Standard Missile 6 battery. The first Standard Missile 6 detonated its proximity fuse, 300 meters from the warhead, sending a cloud of tungsten pellets into the path of the Chinese missile. Several fragments struck the re-entry vehicle, but the DF-26 was built to withstand the extreme pressures of hypersonic flight and continued its descent, slightly scarred but still locked onto the ship. The second interceptor missed entirely as the warhead executed a high-G pull-up maneuver, a feat of engineering that defied the laws of traditional ballistics. The crew of the Decatur could now hear a sound they had never heard before, the atmospheric scream of a projectile moving faster than sound itself, a low-frequency rumble that grew into a roar. The final layer of defense, the rolling airframe missiles, and the close-in weapon system began their automated tracking sequences. The twin 20mm Gatling guns of the close-in weapon system slewed toward the sky, their radar domes nodding as they locked onto the thermal signature of the incoming plasma. The environment on the deck was a chaotic mix of salt spray, the roar of the wind, and the mechanical whine of the gun mounts searching for a target that was now less than 10 seconds away. The commanding officer gripped the arms of his chair, his eyes fixed on the display as the red icon of the DF-26 entered the ship's inner defensive perimeter. 4:13 in the morning. The space between the stars and the sea became a corridor of fire. On the starboard side of the USS Decatur, the rolling airframe missile launcher slewed to its maximum elevation and fired a 2-round burst. The missiles shrieked off the rails, their rocket motors leaving twin corkscrews of white smoke that were instantly shredded by the 30-knot wind. 3 seconds later, the aft close-in weapon system reached its tracking solution. The 20mm Gatling gun began to spin, reaching a rate of fire of 75 rounds per second. The sound was not a sequence of shots, but a continuous, mechanical scream that vibrated through the very marrow of every sailor on board. The muzzle flash was a steady strobe of white light that illuminated the salt spray hanging in the air like a fog of diamonds. The 1,000-kilogram re-entry vehicle of the DF-26 was now a visible streak of orange light, a man-made meteor descending at a 60-degree angle. It punched through the concentrated wall of tungsten and lead tracers as if they were nothing more than rain. The kinetic energy alone was enough to liquefy the air in its path, creating a pressure wave that preceded the physical body of the missile. Inside the Combat Information Center, the last data point recorded by the Aegis system showed the target at a range of 500 meters. There was no time for a human breath, no time for a prayer, only the sudden, overwhelming realization of a catastrophic failure in the defensive shield. The DF-26 warhead slammed into the midship section of the USS Decatur, just aft of the bridge and forward of the vertical launch system. The hypersonic projectile punched straight through the reinforced steel of the main deck, driving through 3 levels of living quarters and the galley before detonating deep within the auxiliary machinery room. The impact was not a single sound, but a sequence of structural failures as the kinetic energy of the warhead was converted into heat and pressure. A fireball 6 stories tall erupted from the center of the ship, bleaching the pre-dawn sky a searing artificial white. The explosion tore a hole in the starboard hull 10 meters wide, and the main deck buckled upward like wet cardboard, the steel plates snapping along the weld lines with the sound of 1,000 rifle shots. The shockwave threw the commanding officer and the entire bridge crew against the forward windows, the force of the blast shattering the heavy glass into 1,000,000 jagged fragments. Inside the Combat Information Center, men were tossed like rag dolls, their bodies slamming into consoles and bulkheads as the deck beneath them buckled. The smell of the ocean was instantly replaced by the acrid stink of vaporized hydraulic fluid, burnt insulation, and the coppery tang of blood. The USS Decatur lurched 20 degrees to port, its hull screaming as the structural skeleton of the ship twisted under the immense torque of the explosion. The vibration was so intense that it shook the fillings in the sailors' teeth, followed by a sudden, terrifying silence as the main power grid failed, plunging the entire vessel into a red-lit darkness. Black, oily smoke began to boil from the gaping wound in the ship's side, rising into the cold Philippine air in a dense column that blotted out the stars. The fire was fueled by thousands of gallons of F-76 diesel fuel from a ruptured service tank, creating a localized inferno that reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees. Below the play waterline, the sea began to roar into the machinery spaces, the pressure of the ocean outside driving a wall of water through the jagged breach. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames, the hiss of high-pressure steam escaping from ruptured lines, and the low, rhythmic groaning of the Prusa ship as it fought to stay upright in the heavy swell. The immediate aftermath was a scene of professional discipline struggling against absolute chaos. Damage control teams, trained for this specific nightmare, began to crawl through the smoke-filled passageways, their breathing apparatuses hissing in the dark. The decks were slick, with a mixture of seawater, oil, and firefighting foam. The ship was still moving forward under its own momentum, but the engines were dead and the steering was unresponsive. The USS Decatur, once a pinnacle of military engineering, was now a broken, burning island of steel, listing further to port with every passing minute as the ocean claimed its entry. 4:15 in the morning. The Philippine Sea was a void of black water and cold wind, but the USS Decatur was a beacon of orange flame and thick, oily smoke. The destroyer was drifting at latitude 15 degrees north, 130 degrees east, its forward momentum dying as the sea began to swallow the midship section. Inside the shattered hull, the damage control assistant took charge of the primary circuit, his voice cracking over the battery-powered emergency lanterns. He ordered the activation of the main space fire doctrine, a systematic plan designed to save the ship even when the heart of the vessel had been ripped open. The air in the passageways was a toxic soup of vaporized paint, burning hydraulic fluid, and the freezing salt spray that was now geysering through the ruptured bulkheads. Repair Locker 2, located forward of the blast zone, was the first to respond. 22 sailors, their faces hidden behind the masks of their self-contained breathing apparatuses, moved toward the inferno. They carried heavy hoses charged with aqueous film-forming foam, the white liquid surging through the lines at a pressure of 100 pounds per square inch. The deck beneath their boots was slick with a mixture of diesel fuel and seawater, making every step a gamble against a 10-degree list to port. The heat from the auxiliary machinery room was radiating through the steel bulkheads, blistering the gray paint and turning the metal into a searing radiator that could melt flesh on contact. The damage control teams worked with a desperate, practiced efficiency that reflected thousands of hours of United States Navy training. They were not fighting a single fire, but a complex series of chemical and electrical eruptions. In the auxiliary machinery room, the temperature had reached 800 degrees Celsius, enough to weaken the structural integrity of the main transverse bulkheads. The sailors directed their foam streams into the jagged hole created by the DF-26, the chemical bubbles hissing and popping as they struck the white-hot wreckage of the generator sets. The steam produced by the cooling effort was so dense that it blinded the nozzlemen, forcing them to rely on the thermal imaging cameras held by their team leaders. Below the waterline, the situation was even more dire. The kinetic energy of the Chinese missile had not just pierced the hull, it had shattered the secondary support structures that held the ship together. Seawater was roaring into the lower levels at a rate of 5,000 gallons per minute, a volume that the ship's emergency submersible pumps could not hope to match. The flooding was concentrated in the interior communication space and the lower ammunition handling rooms for the 5-inch gun. 7 sailors were confirmed killed in the initial impact, their duty stations erased by the fireball, while another 15 remained unaccounted for in the flooded compartments. The damage control assistant ordered the immediate closure of all watertight doors on Deck 3, a brutal but necessary decision that sealed the fate of anyone still trapped below. On the bridge, the commanding officer had regained consciousness, his face mapped with shallow cuts from the place, shattered glass. He stood on a deck that was tilted at a steep angle, holding onto the navigation console to keep his footing. The primary radar was dead, the radio arrays were twisted scrap metal, and the only light came from the red emergency lanterns and the flickering fires midships. He looked out at the dark horizon, knowing that the thermal signature of the burning ship was visible for hundreds of miles. He ordered the executive officer to establish a manual communications relay using handheld radios, trying to reach any other vessel. In Carrier Strike Group 5, the environment of the ship had become a predator. The smell of the sea was now a threat, a reminder of the millions of tons of water pressing against the weakened hull. The sound of the wind screaming through the broken bridge windows was punctuated by the rhythmic, metallic banging of loose deck plates and the distant, muffled thud of secondary explosions. Every few minutes, the ship would groan, a deep structural vibration that started in the keel and moved through the entire frame. It was the sound of a destroyer losing its buoyancy, the steel complaining as the center of gravity shifted further toward the ocean floor. Despite the mounting, casualties, and the loss of primary power, the crew of the USS Decatur did not panic. They moved through the smoke in disciplined lines, passing fire extinguishers and shoring timbers from hand to hand. They were operating on pure adrenaline and the ingrained habits of the fleet. The medical teams had established a secondary triage station in the flight deck hangar, treating 42 personnel for smoke inhalation, third-degree burns, and shrapnel wounds. The air there was cold and smelled of the sea, a brief respite from the choking heat of the interior. But even there, the list of the ship was impossible to ignore. The deck was no longer a stable platform. It was a sliding board, pulling everything toward the rising water on the port side. 4:45 in the morning. The USS Decatur was no longer a functioning warship. It was a dying island of steel, tilting dangerously into the dark swells of the Philippine Sea. The list to port had reached 15 degrees, and the salt spray from the 3-meter waves was now washing over the edge of the main deck, mingling with the white firefighting foam and the black streaks of fuel oil. The destroyer, DDG-73, groaned with every roll, a deep, structural screech of protesting metal that could be heard even over the roar of the wind. Inside the hull, the battle for survival had reached a tipping point. The damage control assistant reported via a handheld radio that the secondary transverse bulkhead at frame 174 had finally buckled, under the weight of 3,000 tons of seawater. The failure was preceded by a sound like a freight train crashing through a wall as the reinforced steel rivets sheared off and sent metal fragments flying through the dark, flooded compartments. With the bulkhead gone, the ocean began to pour into main engine room 2, the largest open space in the aft section of the ship. The flooding was now uncontrollable, and the list increased to 20 degrees in less than 3 minutes. On the bridge, The commanding officer stood with his feet braced against the navigation console, his eyes fixed on a mechanical inclinometer that was slowly ticking toward the point of no return. He had spent 22 years in the United States Navy, and every instinct told him that the ship was no longer buoyant enough to survive the next hour. The engineering officer of the watch confirmed that all auxiliary power was lost and the emergency generators had been submerged. There was no compressed air left to blow the ballast tanks, and no way to trim the vessel. The air on the bridge was freezing, smelling of the open ocean, and the sharp chemical stink of the smoke still rising from the midship's crater. The commanding officer looked at his executive officer and gave the order that is the hardest for any captain to utter: abandon ship. It was not a call of defeat, but a professional, disciplined decision to save the lives of the 284 sailors still on board. The order was relayed through the ship using megaphones and runner relays. The words, abandon ship, all hands to muster stations on the high side, echoing through the smoke-filled passageways and the dark, red-lit decks. The evacuation was a testament to the rigorous training of the 7th Fleet. There was no screaming, no frantic rushing for the rails. Sailors moved in orderly lines toward the starboard side, which was now high out of the water. They were wearing their life jackets and carrying the wounded on stretchers, their movements synchronized by months of drills. The environment on the deck was brutal. The wind was gusting to 40 kilometers per hour, and the deck was tilted at such an angle that the sailors had to use the lifelines to pull themselves upward. The smell of the sea was overwhelming now, a cold, heavy presence that seemed to be reaching up for the ship. One by one, the 25-man inflatable life rafts were launched. They hit the water with a series of splashes, their bright orange canopies inflating instantly against the black waves. The sailors lowered the wounded first, using a combination of manual litters and ropes to ensure they reached the raft safely. 60 personnel were already in the water, or in rafts, when the ship took another sudden lurch to port, the angle increasing to 25 degrees. The sound of internal machinery, breaking loose and sliding across the decks, rumbled like distant thunder beneath the feet of the remaining crew. The commanding officer remained on the bridge until the very last group of sailors had cleared the forward deck. He watched as the final life raft pulled away from the hull, the small orange lights on the sailors' life vests bobbing, like stars on the surface of the dark water. The USS Decatur was now a ghost ship, a blackened, broken silhouette, against the first gray light of the dawn. The smoke from the DF-26 strike was still trailing into the sky, a funeral shroud for a vessel that had served for over 30 years. The cold air carried the sounds of whistles and the shouted coordinates of the raft commanders as they began the process of grouping together for mutual protection in the heavy seas. As the commanding officer stepped off the high side of the deck and into the freezing water, he felt the immense, slow vibration of the ship's keel as it continued to settle. The temperature of the water was 21 degrees Celsius, a shock that stole the breath from his lungs. Around him, the Philippine Sea was a chaotic landscape of whitecaps and dark troughs. But the discipline of the crew held firm. They were no longer a destroyer, but they were still a unit, waiting for the sunrise and the rescue they knew would come from the horizon. 5:30 in the morning. The Philippine Sea was no longer an empty expanse of dark water, but a complex search and rescue grid, coordinated from the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan, 200 miles to the east. Carrier Strike Group 5 had been moving 20 plays 1 at maximum speed since the first flash of the DF-26 impact was detected by orbital sensors. High above the scattered life rafts of the USS Decatur, an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft circled at 30,000 feet. Its massive rotating radar dome was pulsing with energy, acting as the tactical quarterback for an operation that involved 12 different aircraft and 3 surface vessels. The air inside the Hawkeye was cold and smelled of ozone. The 4 crew members focused on the glowing green symbols that represented the clusters of survivors bobbing in the 3-meter swells. The primary rescue assets were the MH-60 Sierra helicopters of Helicopter Sea Combat Squadron 12. 4 of these aircraft were now on station, their twin engines screaming as they fought the erratic winds at low altitude. Each helicopter was a flying ambulance, equipped with internal fuel tanks that allowed for 4 hours of flight time, but the distance from the carrier meant that fuel logistics were a constant concern. The pilots had to balance the weight of the survivors they picked up against the picked, remaining JP-5 fuel in their tanks, calculating exactly how many personnel they could hoist before being forced to return to a nearby destroyer for a deck landing. Refueling. The first MH-60 Sierra hovered at 50 feet above a cluster of 3 orange life rafts. The downwash from the 4-bladed rotor was a violent force that flattened the whitecaps and turned the salt spray into a stinging horizontal rain. The smell of the sea was instantly overwhelmed by the sharp, hot stench of burnt kerosene from the helicopter's exhaust. A rescue swimmer, dressed in a black neoprene suit and wearing a high-visibility helmet, sat in the open cabin door. He checked his harness one last time before plunging into the 21-degree water. The impact was a physical shock, but his training took over instantly. He swam through the churning foam toward the first raft, his movements rhythmic and powerful against the resistance of the heavy swell. The logistics of the rescue were a study in synchronized precision. As the swimmer reached the raft, he began the process of triaging the survivors. The most critically injured, those with severe burns or internal trauma from the initial blast, were prioritized for the first hoists. The helicopter's winch operator lowered the rescue basket, the steel cable humming with tension as it descended through the spray. Each lift took exactly 90 seconds. The basket would hit the water, the swimmer would secure the sailor, and the winch would haul them upward, into the vibrating cabin of the Seahawk. Inside, 2 search and rescue medical technicians worked in the cramped, red-lit space, starting intravenous lines and applying trauma dressings while the aircraft was still in a hover. On the horizon, the silhouettes of 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the USS Higgins and the USS Howard, appeared through the gray morning mist. They were moving at 25 knots. Their crews prepared to receive the survivors and provide long-term medical care. The Higgins acted as the secondary command node, its flight deck cleared and ready for lily pad operations, where the helicopters would land, offload the wounded, and take on fresh fuel without shutting down their engines. This allowed the air assets to remain on station longer, maximizing the window of survival for those still in the water. The logistics of the hot pump refueling required 20 sailors on the class's flight deck to work in the path of the rotor wash, their movements a practice dance of connecting heavy fuel hoses and checking safety couplings. In the middle of a pitching sea, the coordination of the search was assisted by the use of Link 16 tactical data links, which allowed every aircraft and ship to see the exact location of every deployed life raft in real time. This digital map was crucial, as the heavy current of the Philippine Sea was drifting the survivors to the southwest at a rate of 3 knots. Without the constant updates from the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, the rescue helicopters would have been searching empty water within an hour. The environment was a constant adversary. Rising sun was now creating a blinding glare on the surface of the water, making visual spotting nearly impossible. The crews relied on the infrared sensors in the noses of the helicopters to pick up the heat signatures of the sailors' bodies against the cold background of the cold ocean. By 6 in the morning, over 150 personnel had been recovered from the water. The flight deck of the USS Higgins was a scene of controlled intensity, with medical teams moving stretchers into the hangar bay as fast as the helicopters could deliver them. The air was filled with the rhythmic thumping of the rotor blades and the shouted orders of the deck officers. Every sailor involved in the operation was pushed to the limit of their endurance, fueled by the knowledge that their comrades were at the mercy of the sea. The logistics of survival were not just about machines and fuel, but about the relentless, professional application of military doctrine. 6 in the morning. The hull of the USS Decatur was no longer a ship, but a vertical monument of charred steel rising from the Philippine Sea. The final moments of the destroyer, DDG-73, were witnessed by the crews of the rescue helicopters and the survivors in the life rafts, who watched in a heavy, communal silence. The sun had finally broken the horizon, casting a cold, gold light over the whitecaps, and the oily slick that stretched for miles across the water. The environment was deceptively beautiful, the bright light reflecting off the salt spray, but it only served to illuminate the catastrophic damage inflicted by the Chinese DF-26 missile. The air trapped inside the forward compartments began to vent, with a sound like a dying animal, a high-pitched scream of escaping pressure that could be heard over the roar of the wind. The stern of the ship rose high into the air, revealing the twin propellers and the massive rudder, now motionless and dripping with seawater. The 8,300-ton vessel seemed to hesitate for a heartbeat, balanced on the edge of the abyss before the last of the internal bulkheads collapsed. At exactly 6:10 in the morning, the USS Decatur slid backward into the deep water, descending toward the ocean floor 5,000 meters below. On the radar screens of the USS Higgins and the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan, the digital icon for the Decatur blinked once, turned a dull gray, and then disappeared. The tactical data link simply reported a lost track. In the Combat Information Center of the Higgins, the silence was absolute. The sailors stood at their consoles, their faces illuminated by the green glow of the displays, processing the reality that a high-end ballistic missile defense asset had been erased from the order of battle in a single engagement. The loss of the destroyer represented not just a tactical defeat, but a significant strategic shift in the contested waters of the Philippine Sea. The immediate assessment by Indo-Pacific Command was clinical and professional. The strike had proven that the DF-26 was a viable threat to surface groups, even those equipped with the latest AN/SPY-6 radar and Standard Missile-6 interceptors. Of the 300 personnel assigned to the Decatur, 274 were recovered. 11 were confirmed dead in the initial impact and fire, while 15 remained missing in action, their last known locations now at the bottom of the sea. The cost of the engagement was measured in billions of dollars, and, more importantly, in the loss of seasoned, highly trained American sailors. As the rescue ships began to turn back toward Guam, the smoke from the sinking was finally dispersed by the morning wind. The oil slick remained, a dark stain on the blue water that would eventually be broken down by the currents. The United States Navy had already begun the process of re-evaluating its carrier strike group defense layers, moving more cruisers and destroyers into the region to compensate for the gap in the shield. The atmosphere across the fleet was one of grim determination. There was no room for grief in the middle of a high-intensity campaign. There was only the cold, hard work of analyzing the data and preparing for the next launch. The loss of the USS Decatur would be studied in naval academies for decades, a case study in the lethality of hypersonic weapons and the razor-thin margins of modern missile defense. But for the survivors on the deck of the USS Higgins, the reality was simpler. They stood wrapped in wool blankets, drinking hot coffee, and looking out at the empty space where their ship had been. The sea was once again a vast, indifferent void, and the only reminder of the battle was the smell of salt and the lingering, metallic tang of the smoke that refused to leave their lungs.